You know, when you combine the total strength of both armies here at Gettysburg, you get nearly 160,000 men that were fighting in and around the town of Gettysburg here in July of 1863. Now, to me, what that means is that there is 160,000 stories on these fields behind us here waiting to be uncovered and told. Now, while some of these stories will never be uncovered, we are going to uncover one of those stories today, and that is the story of Private Wellington Adams in Company E of the 37th North Carolina. And better yet, we're actually going to be making his trek across the field that would be home to Pickett's charge with one of his direct descendants. His name is Aaron Smith from the YouTube page Forward America. Now, we've worked together before, so I'm pretty excited to meet back up with Aaron here today and share this really neat experience as we walk in his ancestors' footsteps. So we are located at the North Carolina Monument here on Southwest Confederate Avenue. And as you can see, just a beautiful monument here depicting one of the more desperate scenes that would unfold on the fields behind us here. But the fields here that would be home to the charge that we would know as Pickett's charge. Well, Pickett's division wasn't the only division that took part in this attack here. Now, Pickett's division was down near this way towards the Virginia Monument. And in this area, you had the divisions of Pettigrew and Trimble assembling to take part in this charge. So you had 3 total Confederate divisions numbering nearly 15,000 men advancing towards the Union lines just over here. And I don't know if you can see it, but the copse of trees, I know the sun's in the way, is right there. So on the morning of July 3rd of 1863, you had thousands of Confederate forces massing in these woods here all along Confederate Avenue here. And they would be waiting for that dreaded order to attack the Union lines across this open field and into the muzzles of waiting Union muskets and artillery. You know, not to sound morbid, but as I sit here before we meet up with Aaron here, I'm sitting here looking out across the fields of what would be known as Pickett's charge here today. And, you know, Wellington Adams would not only survive the Battle of Gettysburg here, he would survive the war. And not to sound morbid, but I don't know how anyone survived an attack across this open field. Just looking at how the terrain undulates and how the Union line is up on some high ground here, and we're just advancing into the muzzles of well-trained artillery and thousands of rifled muskets just waiting for us. It's amazing to me how anyone would survive. Kind of like when you think about D-Day, how did anyone get off that beach? That's the kind of feeling that I'm getting here. It's just, you know, it's one of the great things about battlefields. You could come here and kind of piece things together, and you're seeing things on the terrain that you don't see from a book or a map.
How's it going, everyone? I'm Aaron Smith with Forward America. I want to thank James and the Project Past family for having me on the channel. This is such a pleasure to be talking to you guys. I'm in front of the North Carolina Monument, and North Carolina for me is very, very special. My family is from North Carolina. We're from Western North Carolina, Watauga County, a little town called Zionville. Beautiful, beautiful country. And sadly, in recent weeks, it's been absolutely wrecked by Hurricane Helene. So this speaking to you guys brings on a whole new meaning for me. Not only that, but I had an ancestor here at Gettysburg, Wellington Adams. He was a private in Company E of the 37th North Carolina. Company E, their nickname was the Watauga Minutemen. And Wellington was about 33 years old during the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. I myself am 33 years old. So it's very, very special to me to be here talking to you about this. Now, day 3, Pickett's charge. Probably one of the most climactic, dramatic events in all of American history. The entire Battle of Gettysburg is on the line. So let's go back in time to the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863. About 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the afternoon. There will be 150 cannons behind me, all down this tree line, up to Seminary Ridge, even on Oak Ridge and Oak Hill. The earth will erupt with fire. You see, Lee's plan is this. He's going to attack the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. And the day before, Lee, he had assaulted the left flank in areas such as Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, Little Round Top, the Wheatfield. He had attacked the left at Culp's Hill. He didn't quite break through. And his logic was this. I had attacked the left, I had attacked the right, the center must be weak. So Robert E. Lee, that late morning, early afternoon, he will begin to move approximately 12,500 troops along this tree line, and they're going to assault the Union center. Now, the men in these woods waiting as this terrible bombardment occurred, these were not fresh troops, these were not green troops, no, they were battle-hardened veterans, such as my ancestor, Wellington Adams. You see, Wellington, he was conscripted in April of 1862. He had been at Antietam with A.P. Hill's Light Division as they furiously marched from Harper's Ferry to Antietam to save the Confederate effort at that battle. He had been at Chancellorsville, a part of Jackson's glorious, incredible flanking march upon the 11th Corps. The 11th Corps here at Gettysburg, they would experience something very similar that they experienced at Chancellorsville and be driven off the field. And so here he is at Gettysburg, this terrible, horrendous, magnificent cannon bombardment happening a few dozen yards in front of him. As the ground shook, these men, these battle-hardened veterans, they realized the task ahead of them. They realized that they were going to march over 3/4 of a mile across open fields to assault a fortified position, a position filled with the 2nd Corps of the Union Army, a position filled with artillery batteries, those batteries focusing upon them the entire time that they would be marching across this field. But still, they all made a decision in that moment to follow those orders. So I want you to join me and James as we walk in the footsteps of my ancestor here at Gettysburg. So in this field back here would have been Lane's brigade of the 3rd Corps, A.P. Hill's Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. That's where the 37th North Carolina found its home. And they would have been back here. They were essentially the second line in this assault. Ahead of them would have been Pettigrew's division. And these men, they would hear the terrible, terrible cannon fire last for about an hour. Then all would fall silent. And these men of the 37th North Carolina, gathered from Ashe County, Buncombe County, Watauga County, they knew what their fate was. All across these fields, into the woods to my left, would have been Confederate soldiers, Butternut and Gray. 12,500 men, about twice the size of modern-day Gettysburg. And soon they would all assault the center of the Union line.
All right, so we're beginning our trek across the fields here in the footsteps of the 37th North Carolina. So the North Carolina monument is just up there, so we made our way into the field here, and we were a tad off trail because it's important to remember battles weren't fought on trails and paved roads. They were fought in empty fields, forests, hillsides, cliffs, things of that nature. So we're trying to follow in the footsteps of the 37th as best we can. So Aaron, take it away.
So the first line of Confederate troops, they're making their way across the field. We're at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon or so. The second line, where the 37th North Carolina is, after about 200 yards of movement, from that first line, they are going to move out. And the 37th North Carolina, they are going to be on the left flank of that Confederate attack. Not the far left flank, mind you. The far left flank is going to belong to Brockenbrow's Virginians. And Brockenbrough kind of has a lackluster performance at Gettysburg. On day one, his troops kind of floundered from some very awkward movement. They didn't really get into a whole lot of action, and they're going to experience some very heavy casualties here on day 3. Brockenbrow's troops, they're going to be moving on this left flank, and here we have the 37th North Carolina and Lane's brigade. And the men, they're going to be marching across these fields, and later on, years after the war, many of these men are going to recollect and reminisce about this movement as being some of the finest movement, the finest marching ever done in the American Civil War. Better than any dress parade they ever had. The men are going to move across these fields, and soon they're going to come within cannon range. And they're going to be facing those heavy, solid cannon shots, the kind of shots that bounce off the ground and take out rows of men. If you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, there's a scene there during one of the battles where the cannonball bounces off the ground and takes off a man's leg. So it's very, very vicious stuff, and casualties are soon going to increase. So as these men marched forward in fine fashion, they would encounter many obstacles, fences like this being one of those obstacles. And under heavy cannon fire, they would have to overcome this fence, either moving these planks, these rails out of the way, or finding some way to get around them. It's going to slow these men up. It's going to make them easier targets for the artillerymen on Cemetery Ridge. Not only that, but this ground is rather undulating. At first glance, it might appear very flat, very farm fieldy. And it is, but it's not flat. It's very hilly. It's very undulating. Those undulations would provide cover, but as soon as you would rise to the top of a hill or a small gully, you would find yourself a prime target for those artillerymen. So we're now here on the Bliss farm, and by the time these men, the 37th North Carolina Lane's Brigade, marched to this point, this area would have been smoldering ruins. The Bliss farm was essentially the middle of no man's land, and you have the Union line over there, the Confederate line over there. This was essentially the middle of that, and because of that, this was a prime target for sharpshooters to come set up shop and start picking away at either line. So because of that, early on July 3rd, sometime in the morning, there's going to be a captain from Connecticut, the 14th Connecticut. He's going to ride out here, and he is going to set fire to the Bliss farm and the surrounding buildings. That way, neither side could use them. So as the Confederates, they make their way across these ruins engulfed in flame, this is when stuff is really going to get serious. Stuff's really going to get real. Back there, they were being harassed by cannon fire. Here, they're coming under direct fire. And not only do we have the solid balls coming over here, but you also start to get into the shells, those exploding shells, essentially a grenade being fired out of a cannon, a fuse in there, and once that fuse is up, that ball is going to explode. And this is where casualties are going to start to increase severely. But still these men pushed on. Still these men made the charge, following orders, wanting to follow what Robert E. Lee's plans were and take the center of that line.
So before we continue our trek, I did want to focus a little more on the Bliss farm here. So just to kind of reorient ourselves, the Confederate line was back this way. That's where we began our trek. We've made it about halfway across, maybe a little under halfway, and we've made it to the area of the Bliss farm here. So imagine you probably had a few buildings, you had the Bliss property, and this is the general area where the 14th Connecticut would send out that captain, and he would burn the structure in this area here. Now I'm going to pan to my right, and you can kind of make out the Union line here. Just on this high ground here, that is the general area of the angle. So you can see how this property here really was smack dab in the middle of both of these armies. So one of my favorite things about history is every single one of us is connected with some sort of event from the past, whether it be the American Civil War, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the space race. We all have family and we all have ancestors that are connected to some event in history. And obviously, we're walking in the footsteps of Aaron's ancestor, the 37th North Carolina. I had an ancestor here that was in the 80th New York. They were up on the angle. Now, they probably weren't shooting directly at each other, but the fact that Aaron and I are able to walk this field together, and meanwhile, over 160 years ago, our ancestors were enemies. That shows you how far we have come, and that shows you everyone has a connection to history, and that's why I love history so much. So I did want to stop because Aaron mentioned the terrain a little earlier. So I don't know if the camera's picking it up, but you can kind of see how the terrain dips down and then pops back up in that location. And granted, there was a World War I camp here, Camp Colt. So the terrain's changed maybe a little bit, but this still gives you a pretty good snapshot of what the men of North Carolina went through. And Aaron, I did want to ask you, before I forget, have you made this walk before? And if so, does it get more special? Do you learn new things every time you make this walk? What exactly are you feeling right now?
Yeah, so I have made this walk before, and every time I make it, I learn something new. I appreciate something a little bit deeper. This was not an easy traverse for these men. It was hot, 86, 87 degrees in that brutal July humidity here in south central Pennsylvania. These men were wearing wool clothing, cotton undergarments. This was pretty intense. Not only that, but they were facing fire from those artillery cannons up on the cemetery ridge. And then as they get closer, they're going to face that small arms fire. All of that, plus the fact that you're a hardened veteran. You know what this mission is. You know that more than likely, you're going to be severely wounded, if not killed, when you get up to that ridge. All of that, and just thinking about that, brings such a deeper appreciation to what these men went through, what they experienced. These farm boys from these little North Carolina towns. The Adamses, on my mother's side, they were from Cove Creek, North Carolina. Now, Watauga County in 1860, there were 0 plantations. There were less than 10 slaves in the entire county. These were poor, simple, rural farmers. And here they are, hundreds of miles away from home, marching across a field here in Gettysburg, certainly to their doom. And so every time I make this walk, I gain a deeper sense of appreciation for what these men were asked to do. They just accepted that this was their mission, and they did it. And it's that type of gumption that I truly appreciate. You don't complain, you just do it. And so every time I make this walk, I gain just a deeper sense of appreciation for what these young men went through on July 3rd, 1863.
Just another brief snapshot of the terrain here at Gettysburg and what the men experienced. You can see Aaron in front of us here. You kind of see he's hitting some high ground here. So we're kind of going uphill. And once we hit that crest of the hill right here, we're going to make some pretty nice targets for Union artillery. But again, panning to my right, see some of the undulations of the terrain here. Again, walking the battlefield really puts things in perspective.
So the Confederates, they're continuing to make their way across the field. And we're here on the far left flank, Brockenbrow's Virginian Brigade. Smaller brigade, about 900 men. They're holding down the left flank of this Confederate attack. And as they make their way through this area, the 8th Ohio, they're going to swing around and end up almost perpendicular with Brockenbrow's brigade and begin to fire into the men's left flank. Brockenbrow, continuing his theme of underperforming at Gettysburg, his men will fall back to the Confederate line, those woods there along Seminary Ridge. Now, Lane's brigade is the far left of this attack. And as the men get closer, they'll start to be the victims of that harassing fire from the 8th Ohio. Not only that, but they're going to be conflicting and confusing orders. Lane himself is going to be operating on the left side of his brigade. And then you have Major General Isaac Trimble operating on the right. Trimble will order an oblique to the right, and all the companies to the right of the 37th North Carolina's color guard and the 7th North Carolina on the far right of the brigade, they will make that wheeling motion to the right. The rest of the brigade will make a wheeling motion to the left to handle the 8th Ohio and the other Union regiments that are now beginning to envelop the left of the Confederate line. There will be a gap formed in Lane's brigade. The 37th North Carolina itself split in half. Unit cohesion will begin to break down as the men approach the wall on Cemetery Ridge. So the men of North Carolina, they would have made their way across this road, the Emmitsburg Road, and where many of their peers, they took comfort and refuge in the shallow sunkenness of that roadbed, the North Carolinians continued to press forward. Lane himself would be on horseback, urging his men forward to the wall. One soldier will remember his horse being struck out from underneath of him, Lane falling to the ground, miraculously unscathed. Looking at the task before him, soldiers to his right beginning to fall back. That great Confederate tide hitting the shore and receding back to Seminary Ridge. Lane will see the futility of the situation and order a withdrawal. Also, miraculously, Wellington Adams, 33 years old, from Cove Creek, Watauga County, North Carolina, a man who had two of his own brothers die in this conflict, both from disease. One in December of 62, the other in February of 63. He will be unscathed throughout this epic, dramatic charge. In fact, Wellington Adams, he will make it through the entirety of the American Civil War without suffering a wound. He will go on to fight in all of the major campaigns of the Eastern Theater. He'll be there at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, the Siege of Petersburg, and ultimately at Appomattox, where, with the rest of his Southern comrades, he will surrender. He will later go back to North Carolina and pass away at the age of 57. A relatively young age, but despite dying so young, he lived such a full life, farming, spending time with his family. You see a lot of soldiers, especially in that part of North Carolina, the western part, where slaves weren't prevalent. There were no plantations. They were just simple Scots-Irish farmers. They wanted to forget about the war and get back to life, the way life used to be, the way life should be: simple, plain, hardworking, surrounded by family.
So before we wrap things up here today, the 37th North Carolina made it probably somewhere in this area before they realized that they just could not advance any farther. And think about, we started way back here. And just to give you another visual here, the Union line is right here. So that would have continued in this general area here. This is the fence line that we just walked up. We crossed that field, we walked up this fence line across the Gettysburg Road, and this is where the battle for the 37th North Carolina ended. But I did want to offer just another visual that you can see here. The angle is right here where that tree is, and here is the Union line. So just before the stone wall here, the 37th North Carolina just could not push further after what they just advanced through.
Guys, that's the story of my ancestor here at Gettysburg. A Confederate, but not a man who owned slaves, not a man who wanted to triumph the Southern cause, but a man who was conscripted and did his duty. A man who lost 2 brothers. A man who went home to a father who lost 2 sons. And it's incredible to stand here at Gettysburg National Military Park, where he fought, where James's ancestor fought. These 2 men on opposite sides of the great American conflict. And here we are, 160 some years later, walking these fields as friends.